Hey guys, this is Nia. Welcome back to my channel. Today I will be swatching my student grade or hobby watercolors. I've used several different brands throughout the years. Since I know a lot of you are new to watercolors, I thought you guys would find this useful if you would like to buy watercolors but have no idea what to get. This is not a review, but rather I'm just going to show you some swatches of the colors that I've used. Just so you get a rough idea of things like vibrancy of colors, transparency, smoothness, and things like that. A lot of this just comes down to preference. I'm just here to show you and tell you my experience of these brands. There are no bad ones. I've had wonderful experience with all of them. It just really depends on how you use them and how much you can control it, I guess, because there are always pros and cons to different sets. It's just up to the user to work around it. So the first one here is a FaberCastell. This watercolor set is so old, and this is what I used in high school and uni. Back then I wasn't really into it. In high school, I probably used it a couple of times, and in uni, I used it to make secondary elements for some of my designs, and that's it. This brand was what I was introduced to back in high school. It's smooth and easy to activate, but as you can probably tell, the colors are quite light. Would probably need to glaze over and over again to get more vibrancy. And this watercolor is so old, I'm not even sure if they still produce it, but it was fun getting it out again. Haven't touched this set for a while. It was in such a mess, I had to really clean the wells and the palette so it's somewhat presentable to look at. Throughout the swatching process, what I will do is take the thickest consistency of the watercolors that I could get the first time round. So I'm not going to layer it or anything, and I'm going to wait for it to completely dry and try to reactivate it with a clean and wet brush, and I'll try to pull the colors. This is the technique that I use a lot of in my paintings, at least that's what I do a lot of these days. So that's the test I'm going to put these watercolors through. I've also placed a line so you can see the transparency of the colors. You can also tell from the first time I put the paint down, it was quite vibrant, but as it dries it changes a lot in vibrancy. It's normal for this to happen in watercolors because it always dries lighter, but in some cases like this it just seems more dull than other watercolor brands. Of course, this is something that you can layer on top as you paint. Despite seeing this as a bad point now, though, I think back then it actually made it easier for me to learn about layering. My main worry when I started using watercolors was covering too much of highlighted areas, so the fact that this dries lighter, it kind of gave me a second chance in order to build the layers of colors. So as I said before, something that seemed as a con for some people depending on their level and where they're at in terms of learning, it could be a plus, and things like this just comes down to preference. In terms of reactivating these colors, it's quite hard to do that except for the darker colors in the last line, but if the paint is not 100% dry, I'm pretty sure you'll get a better transition. It looks like the paint really seeps into the paper and gets absorbed, so it's very hard to reactivate the paint. After uni, I actually didn't touch traditional drawing or painting for a while, and I got into digital painting. So I didn't touch paint for a few years, and I started to miss it. During my time working full-time as a graphic designer, I started using the FaberCastell paints again, and another palette which I found was actually Gouache, since it said opaque watercolor, so I didn't include it in this. After I started painting again, I decided to get a new set for myself, and it was this one, the Koi or the Sakura palette. You've probably seen me using this a lot too. As you can tell, I've dug up deep holes on my palette because I use this set a lot. I love the selection of colors and how vibrant they are compared to what I've used before. Just the palette itself is so presentable. I love the setup, and they also include a separate palette to mix your colors, and you can stick them in the holes depending on how you want to hold your paint. So it's so compact, and this came with a water brush, but I never liked using those brushes, so I didn't end up using it. The downside about this is that it takes quite a while to activate. As you can tell, the palette itself gets quite dry, if you notice from the cracks that I left after the abuse I left with this palette. And I'm not sure if it's because of the cracks or it has always been like that, but some colors tend to be a little bit grainy, and I've only started to notice after I paint flat colors or if you try to get a thick consistency of paint. In the beginning, I used this sparingly like I did with my first palette because I wasn't too confident with my colors, so instead I did a lot of layering. But once I dug deep into the paint literally, that's when I started to notice the graininess of this set. Either way, I had so many good experiences with this set. This really got me comfortable with color mixing, especially with food illustration. I think these 24 colors is a really good base to learn about color choice and color mixing without having too many colors to pick from, because that can be very intimidating, especially if you're just starting out. Even now, the colors that I look for are the colors that are available from this set as my main colors that I use for paintings. Any other student grade watercolors that I got after the set was to basically get a fair idea of different textures and things. I wanted to know different qualities and how they vary from each other, but I kept this my main watercolor set to work with for several years until I got my Holbein, just because of how I was so comfortable with the colors already. With that said, it's actually not my favorite because of the granular textures for some of the colors, and like the FaberCastell, most of the colors are hard to reactivate with some exception, but this is definitely a good set to start with. If you've noticed here, I skipped a color because there's still a puddle on the paint surface and I'm just waiting for it to dry. I'm not giving it any special treatment or anything like that. Most of these colors are also quite transparent, and I like that this palette offers vibrant and yet transparent colors. I just wish it's a bit more smooth in terms of texture, but then again, I know some people actually like grainy textures for special effects. It's just not my cup of tea. I'm just going to quickly write the colors, and after swatching these paints, you can also Google the color charts if you really want to know each individual colors. For the Faber-Castell colors, I didn't include the names of the colors because I couldn't find any. I'm not even sure if they still produce that particular set. I decided to include that one to maybe get a fair idea of what the Faber-Castell watercolors are like. So here are the koi swatches. As you can see, some colors like the permanent orange, the reds, and the blue hues are quite grainy, but some colors are not. Hopefully this will give you a good sense of the colors. The next set that I bought is the Reeves watercolors. Reeves is quite a well-known brand here in Indonesia, but I don't know why I don't see this a lot on social media. These watercolors are easily available in stationery shops in the malls near my house called Paperclip and Gramedia, which are big stores available in different parts of Jakarta. So Reeves has a whole range of art supplies. Since I've always used Reeves acrylic paints, I wanted to know what the watercolor is like, so that's why I decided to buy this one. I think it's around the same price as the Sakura palette, but only for 18 colors instead of 24, so it's not the cheapest. They also sell pan watercolor set, but it didn't look that nice to me because the surface seemed a bit chalky. Looks can be deceiving, who knows, but I ended up buying the tube form of this so I can see how thick I can use the paint to. You'll probably notice that these paints separate a lot, and this is how it was the first time I got them too. Nothing is wrong with them. You can mix them. Sometimes I shake the tubes before putting the paint down, but even then it won't be as mixed. You can also do this with your brush, but as you can tell, it does get quite annoying if you only want a small bit of paint on your palette. I don't actually have too much experience with this paint. Not because it's bad or anything, it's not bad at all, but I was already comfortable with the koi set, as I mentioned. These work nicely and it actually blends or activates nicer than the koi, but the colors aren't as vibrant. As you can probably see, the lemon yellow at the top is very dull compared to the other colors. I'm also not such a big fan of the reds too. Personally, when I paint, I don't actually paint with bright and vibrant colors only. In fact, I like to mute my colors a bit with the opposite temperature, so I wouldn't actually mind this at all, but it's nicer to have an option of the brighter colors because that means you can control how saturated or unsaturated you want your colors. If you have vibrant paint, you can always mute the colors down, but it doesn't work the other way around. This paint, however, reactivates much easier after it dries compared to the koi, and that for me is a definite plus. It's also fairly transparent, which I enjoy. I don't think I can share too much information because I don't have too many experience with this paint though. I know some of you are also concerned about light fastness, which is basically how the paint reacts to light. Some paint lightens as it's exposed to too much light and will become dull after a while. This is something that I have no experience of because I personally paint on my sketchbook most of the time, so it doesn't really get any sun exposure. So this is not something that I can talk about in this video. Overall, this set is also pretty good. The pros are that the colors are transparent, even if you paint it really thickly. Most of the colors also reactivate pretty well, and it's fairly easy to work with. It's also smoother and less grainy than the koi set, which I really appreciate. The downside is that the colors are a bit dull and the paint separates in the tube, which isn't actually a big deal, but this means you won't be able to squeeze out small amounts of paint, and this might be very wasteful if you don't have a palette to keep your paint safe. The next one we're going to look at is the Cotman watercolors. Cotman is a student grade version of the professional brand Winsor & Newton. Where I live, this set is also easily available, but boy, this is very pricey compared to all the other student grade sets. I got this on a discount, and even then, I think it was still around $35 for only 16 colors. I'm not sure, it might be the exchange rate, it might be different in different countries, but that's how much I got it for. With that said, this is by far my favorite in terms of quality of paint. For a pan set, these watercolors activate really easily, so it doesn't take too long to pick up the colors, especially if you miss the top of the pan first. I like that the paint stays smooth even after it's dry. By the way, my set is actually so dry that some colors actually shrunk, but the quality is still really good and I don't see any cracks on the watercolors. I didn't use this a lot on my videos because there's less colors, but I do paint with this off camera, so it wouldn't matter if I take too long mixing the colors to get the shade that I want. And the colors are very vibrant and transparent compared to all the other sets that I've swatched before in this video. It's also very smooth compared to all the others, which means it will also blend nicely and would do really well for transitions in color. In the beginning, when I got this, I didn't notice too big of a difference. It's only after painting this side by side along my koi, and I saw a huge difference in terms of the color vibrancy and the smooth texture compared to the granular texture. I would really much prefer this, but koi wins over price and the fact that I have 24 colors compared to only 16 colors with this one. If you could, however, afford this easily, then I would definitely recommend the Cotman watercolors over the other ones. I like it so much. In fact, I still use this to mix with my Holbein paint sometimes. Not saying this is on par with professional watercolors, but in my opinion, it's the closest because of how rich and how transparent it is. What I found out when I was watching Holbein and Winsor & Newton and the other professional brands is that the paint reactivates easily. You can get a thick consistency really easily, and after it dries on paper, it activates so well all the time, as if fresh paint is squeezed out straight on your paper. But this one, like all the other student brand, isn't rich enough to reactivate completely after it dries on paper. Overall, Cotman watercolors is probably my favorite compared to all the other watercolors that I've tried for the student grade. It's very vibrant, very transparent, and it's smooth. It activates really easily from the pan. Downside to this is that this brand is very pricey compared to all the other sets. It also doesn't reactivate that well after it dries on paper. Last but not least, I'm going to show you my Pentel watercolors. These watercolors are definitely the cheapest among the bunch compared to all the others that I've swatched before. I got it for only around $10 if I convert it to US dollars for 24 tubes of colors. The tubes are fairly small though, it's only 5 milliliters each, but this is so rich that you won't even be needing too much of it to paint. I did a review on these Pentel watercolors before, and I did mention that these paints act like gouache because it's so thick and there are barely any transparent colors in this set. And I think I mentioned that I wouldn't recommend this as starters because it doesn't really feel like actual watercolors. But then again, after thinking about it again, I don't see why not, even though these paints feel like gouache. Gouache is technically opaque watercolors, so if you're not too bothered by the opacity, then you can go for it. I also like the fact that these paints are packaged in small tubes, so if you're just starting out with watercolors, you can get a lot of different colors but in small tubes, so you don't have to worry if you don't like the quality or the paint. You won't have to worry about wasting it. I also like that the holes in the tubes are very small, so you can get such a tiny amount of paint out if you don't want to dry out the paint. When I'm squirting this out, I can feel like these are very thick compared to other tube watercolors, or even compared to the Reefs that I swatched before. There are a couple of colors that were separating, but most of them were good. Even as I'm squeezing it out of the tube, I can feel like these are very thick compared to the Reefs and other watercolor tubes that I've tried. There are a couple of colors that were separating, but most of them were pretty good. It actually feels like squeezing out gouache instead of watercolors. I think someone told me that Pentel watercolors uses dye instead of pigments, which is why it's so smooth. The smoothness is something that I enjoy with this set, so that's a definite plus. It does apply a bit different compared to other watercolors that we've swatched so far, but the Pentel watercolors, even compared to the Cotman, is even more vibrant. This might have something to do with the opacity and the opaque nature of most of these colors though, because if the paints were to be transparent, it would probably show or take on some of the color of the paper. The vibrancy is actually something that I struggled with when I first started to paint with the Pentel set though. As I mentioned, I like to have my colors to have somewhat of a muted feel sometimes, but because these are so vibrant, it threw me off a bit in terms of my color mixing, and the food that I painted kind of looked like toys or unrealistic or unnatural. But this is my favorite paint to work with when I'm painting galaxies, since you will mix a lot of black in to any galaxy painting. Having very vibrant hues really helps keep the contrast between the black colors and the saturation of the hues. So overall, the Pentel is very vibrant, it reactivates well, it's very cheap compared to all the others, it's smooth, but it's mostly opaque and feels a bit like wash paint instead of watercolors. And yeah, so that's it. Those are my thoughts on these watercolors. I'd love to hear your own experiences if you've tried any of these brands. I hope this way, if there are any of you who wants to start watercolors and get your first set, you can get some sort of idea of what you're going to get with these colors that I displayed here. So yeah, that's it. I hope you guys learned something new from watching this or found it relaxing to see all the swatches being laid out. Thank you for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!